Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm your host, Shelley Oreo. Today's podcast is the first of a four-part series on driving under the influence, otherwise known as DUI, starting with today's discussion on DUI involving marijuana, whether the marijuana is on its own or mixed with alcohol or other drugs. Law enforcement, the district attorney's crime lab, and prosecutors have seen an increase in DUIs involving marijuana. To talk more about this public safety issue on our roads and highways, I am joined by CHP Officer Travis Herbert, two criminalists from the DA's crime lab, Mike Toms and Sara, and our lead prosecutor over DUI cases, Kelly Clark. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I have each of you introduce yourselves, including your background and your current roles? And let's see. Officer Herbert, I'll start with you.
Yes, my name is Travis Herbert. I'm officer with the CHP. I've been with CHP for 22 years. I am a drug recognition expert instructor, and I have been a drug recognition expert instructor since 2005. I've been a DRE since 2002. I've seen pretty much every kind of drug that you could possibly imagine somebody under the influence of.
Great. Mike, can you go next?
Yes, my name is Michael Toms. I'm a supervising criminalist for the toxicology section of the crime laboratory. I've been working in the field for about 27 years, and I've also worked in solid dose drugs as well, analyzing those.
And Sara?
Hello, I'm Sara Porter. I am also a criminalist at the Sacramento County Crime Lab. I work in the toxicology section. I've been in there for almost 15 years now, and I have testified in over 250 cases regarding DUI, whether about alcohol or drugs and alcohol combined.
Great. And Kelly?
Good morning. My name is Kelly Clark. I'm a deputy district attorney with the Sacramento District Attorney's Office. I am currently assigned as the lead deputy district attorney in the grant position that is funded by the Office of Traffic Safety through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Currently, this grant is the outreach, training, and education, along with supervising the DUI attorneys in their DUI trials. I've been a DA for approximately 23 years, and I've worked in a whole bunch of different units, but currently I'm in the DUI administration portion of it.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Let's talk about the rise of marijuana-involved DUIs and the increased danger it poses to drivers. Officer Herbert, what are you and other CHP officers seeing on our area roads and highways, even if just anecdotal?
Well, we've seen a marked increase in the number of people who are operating vehicles while under the influence of cannabis and a lot of other drugs. But cannabis in particular, with legalization on a recreational basis, people that prior to that wouldn't try it simply because it was illegal. Now, now they can. And they're going out and smoking cannabis or ingesting it in however many various ways you can ingest it. And, obviously they don't feel drunk, and I'm using the term drunk in air quotes because, I think most of us understand what that feeling is, that sensation of being, drunk. Excuse me. And they don't feel that way. And they think it's okay for them to get behind the wheel and drive. And so it's, when that happens, they don't realize that their faculties, their mind and their physical capabilities, have diminished even a little bit, and they can't operate the same way. So we're seeing a lot of people, again, it's just a lot of people driving under the influence right now, getting involved in collisions. And it's a problem. It's a big problem.
How are officers able to detect marijuana use during a traffic stop, and what are the challenges in detecting that kind of use?
Well, I think the big challenge is, again, that that people don't necessarily feel, and again, use the air quotes around the term drunk. The intoxication is a lot different. And so when they get behind the wheel and they drive, an officer a lot of times will see some of the exact same behaviors, a driving pattern of weaving or swerving, of nearly colliding with another vehicle, of driving too slow, driving too fast, driving without their headlights at night, and a myriad of other things. And then when an officer makes contact with the driver, obviously it doesn't present itself in much the way that alcohol does, with that odor of an alcoholic beverage and a slurred speech. Cannabis is different. That's why it's its own drug category, because it affects the body differently. So we're going to see maybe droopy eyelids, and their pupils might be dilated, and they become red and watery. And then we can obviously smell the odor of cannabis, of burnt cannabis. And so from that point, the officers, their tools at this point are to obviously make observations. How does a person respond when it asks for their license and registration and their driver license and the insurance? How does the driver respond to basic questions that, do you currently live at this address? How does the driver respond to, maybe we ask them to multitask in the vehicle, for instance. I'm going to ask for their registration and insurance. And as they're reaching for their registration and insurance, I may verify some information on the license and make sure that it's correct. And so how that interaction goes says maybe I need to pull this driver out. And so at that point, during the course of my investigation, I feel the need to pull the driver out. I will do so, and we will conduct field sobriety tests in a DUI investigation, very similarly to one that would be with alcohol. We would administer the same tests, and we would look for very much and a lot of the same things that we would look for in terms of impairment.
What are any specific trends or insights you have into use among juveniles specifically?
I think the biggest trend, particularly with juveniles, is like obviously vaping is very popular right now with them, and so you're seeing a lot of kids vaping, and they may swipe some from their parents' vaping kit or something like that. But so vaping is a big trend. But I think a big part of at least the whole trend in general when it comes to cannabis is the attitude of what it is and what is cannabis. So for instance, I teach a class at UC Davis, and it's called Drugs and Society. And there's multiple components to this course. And there's a law enforcement component, there's a medical component, there is a drug use addiction component. There's advocate component, mental health component as well. And what I find interesting is when I'm teaching this class and as law enforcement, my goal is to talk to them about all drugs. And I have a very libertarian approach to this. Is as long as you don't mess around and affect somebody else, you do whatever you want at home. That's my approach with them in this particular class. So I said, this is what's going to happen if you ingest, and these are the effects that you can get. So you go down the list of, cocaine, oh, that's bad. And the students are saying, yes, it's bad. And methamphetamine, oh, yes, it's bad. And then you talk about, PCP and heroin and all it's bad. And all of a sudden you get to cannabis and that flip-flops on its head. And it's one of those instances where suddenly cannabis is going to bring world peace. It's going to end mass hunger. There's going to be, all the stars are going to align. Everything it's the best thing that's ever happened. It's going to cure every disease. And it's just fine. And, a lot of them are very surprised when I tell them this is what happens when you smoke cannabis, and they think that it's good for them. They think it makes them better. It's going to get rid of their cancer. It's going to do everything. So it's the attitude and the perception of cannabis that it's not a drug. And two, it's going to make you, a better person and everything else. So I think that we have to, in our approach to anything, particularly when it comes to driving under the influences, we have to educate our young people about the dangers of driving and talk to them in terms of real world consequences of ingesting cannabis.
Great. Thanks so much for all the insight on the front end, on the streets. So let's go from the field to the lab. Mike and Sara, can you talk about what you're seeing at the crime lab when analyzing samples and DU cases in general?
I can speak about some of the statistics that we have. Basically, the marijuana number of positives has increased about 10% since we started analyzing for all cases. So before we didn't analyze all cases for marijuana, we would only analyze cases that were drug-related DUIs or cases where the alcohol level was less than 0.08%. Since we started analyzing the cases for, or all cases for drugs and alcohol, it's increased about 10% to 22% of the cases.
And Mike, when did you start, sorry to interrupt, when did you start analyzing all this?
In September of 2020.
Okay.
I averaged out basically the years from 2016 to 2020, and the average is about 12% of the cases had marijuana. But once analyzing all of the cases for marijuana, which includes all of those over 0.09%, the number of cases increased to 22%, which means that there are a lot more people smoking marijuana with alcohol than just with marijuana alone.
The combination of alcohol and marijuana, can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Studies have been done with low levels of marijuana and moderate levels of marijuana with low levels of alcohol. And it's basically showed that the impairment has been exponentially increased. So it's not just an additive. It causes way more impairment than just having either of the two on board. So it's something that people don't expect to happen, but apparently they choose to use both drugs because of how it feels.
So Mike and Sara, can you tell us about the database project the lab is working on with the coroner's office and why you think it's important and how it will help with your work and help law enforcement?
Yes, we're working with the coroner's office to create a database that allows both parties to pull information. And the information that we don't have readily available to both of us is the marijuana impaired driving and the number of the deaths that the coroner is seeing, being able to tie those together. So with this database, we'll be able to pull out the manner of death and the cause of death, and also pull out whether or not, with our testing, whether or not marijuana was associated. So it'll give us better information about potentially marijuana induced crashes. Marijuana-induced crashes in the population.
Kelly, moving to the prosecution of these cases, can you explain the different DUI charges and the difference between them when it comes to alcohol, marijuana, or a mix between the drugs?
Sure. The driving under the influence is under Vehicle Code Section 23-152. There are different subsections. So 23-152A is for alcohol, meaning that you are driving under the influence of alcohol. That means you could be a 0.06, a 0.07 blood alcohol. And if your driving has been affected such that you're no longer safe to drive as a sober person, then you can be arrested and convicted of 23-152A. 23-152B is driving under the influence of alcohol with a 0.08% or higher. So that is, by law, it's the per se limit. If you are a 0.08 or higher, you are, by definition, under the influence of alcohol. So those are the two just alcohol sections. 23-152F is the drug section. That means you're driving under the influence of a drug. That could be marijuana, it could be methamphetamine, it could be heroin, it could be any number of drugs, or prescription medication as well. Also, over-the-counter medication. I mean, you could be under the influence of NyQuil, and get pulled over if you're driving as being influenced. Finally, we have the 23152G, which is a combo. That is that you're under the influence of a combination of an alcoholic beverage and a drug. And again, those are, that would be with marijuana, methamphetamine, any of the type of drugs we've previously discussed, but in combination with alcohol.
When offenders mix marijuana with alcohol, how does that affect their driving? And this is really either for anybody. Is there a particular behavior that it makes them drive in a certain way when those particular things are mixed?
Well, with cannabis or drugs in general, what we look for in field sobriety tests, and I wish that if I was the boss, I would change from the term field sobriety test, and I would say divided attention tests, and they would become divided attention tests. We're assessing somebody's ability to operate a motor vehicle by using tests that divide their attention amongst a multitude of tasks. For instance, the walk and turn test. We ask them to stand in a specified manner, to pay attention to my instructions, and to walk on a straight line, turn around in a prescribed manner, and walk back. And so they have to stand in that prescribed manner. They have to pay attention to what I'm telling them, and then they have to duplicate the tasks that I'm asking them to do. So it involves all of the same faculties that you utilize while you're operating a motor vehicle. You're using spatial awareness, you're using visual input, you're using vestibular input, and then you're using a cognitive inputs where you have to pay attention. Okay, he told me to take 9 steps down, and then he told me to turn around in a specific manner and then take 9 steps back. So all of these things that you have to put together, and they're doing the same exact thing. You're doing the exact same thing while you're driving. And so you may not pay attention to all the things that you do while you're driving because you do it so much and so often. For instance, when was the last time you thought about if you have a key in an ignition, right? And you inserted the key into the ignition. When was the last time you actually looked at the ignition cylinder and inserted the key into the ignition?
No.
You don't think about it. It just happens, correct? I mean, it's just like, whoop, it just magically happens. Did the ignition cylinder magically find itself or it just magically pop on this thing? No, you've done it so many times and your body's so used to that. And at the same time, you didn't even think about it, but at the same time, you put your foot on the brake, didn't you? You didn't have to think about that. Well, drugs affect our ability to do that kind of stuff. To where now I might be more difficult to insert my key into the ignition. I may not put my foot on the brake pedal as I'm going down on a cognitive, I have to know this exit to get to this particular place. I may miss the exit, or I'm unable to maintain my lane, or I'm going too fast. I didn't pay attention to the speed limit, or I'm going way too slow. I'm not staying up with traffic. So that's what we look for. That's what we assess. And cannabis, it affects somebody's ability to do all that stuff. But it's not like alcohol to where you have balance issues as well, but we just can't pay attention. And that's for cannabis, that's just the big one.
I will say too, when you're combining the cannabis with the alcohol, sometimes you kind of run into a tricky situation where, depending on the level of alcohol present, the alcohol symptoms are actually some of them are similar to the cannabis symptoms, but what happens is the alcohol symptoms can kind of eclipse the cannabis symptoms. Because if a person is at a high level of alcohol, basically they're just going to look like an impaired due to alcohol person. And then, when you have to try to explain that in court, well, why are there no symptoms of the cannabis? And it's not that they're not there. It's just that maybe the alcohol symptoms are so pronounced that they're kind of covering or masking some of those other symptoms. But as Travis was saying, a lot of the same types of symptoms issues, I should say, that you would expect with attention tasks, you would have that from alcohol and from cannabis. So again, with the impaired divided attention, impaired attention maintenance and concentration. So like monotonous driving, think like freeway driving at night. Somebody might get a little too complacent with like how easy this seems. And they might actually run into trouble that way as well. Impaired ability to gauge how fast or how slow you're driving. So you might have more speeding, or driving too slowly. Or if you have situations where the paranoia has set in, and then you have people who are also, they're trying to overcompensate for how they think they might be driving, and then they might end up actually driving less safe as a result of that.
And to what like Travis was saying earlier, if you liken the driving to when you were first a brand new driver, how overwhelming it is because you're thinking about every single individual thing you have to do, checking both mirrors, driving the right speed, all of that happens. And most people have been through that, obviously, because they're drivers and they know how overwhelming it is. And now it's something that kind of just happens in the background, that they have to do all of this stuff. And they have to do it in an environment that's changing at 30, 40 miles an hour or however fast they're driving.
Kelly, did you want to add something?
No, I think it's important just what Travis was saying about the divided attention and how you don't think about all the things you have to do. Just driving down the street, it is overwhelming, whether there's pedestrians or other cars or a ball that jumps out in front of you or a child runs out to get the ball, all these things. And if your reaction time is slowed, you will certainly have some pretty serious issues.
This next question is for all of you. We talked a lot about cannabis, marijuana, but I think most people know that the marijuana of today is not the marijuana of the 70s. Can you all comment on how marijuana today is different?
It's way more potent, and I'm talking way more potent. I think I just read somewhere that it was almost 40% THC from a plant, that was grown with the Sensimilla grow technique, and so just the astronomical levels of THC that we're seeing. And then when you get into things that are concentrates like butane hash oil, there's alcohol quick wash method, and then you're getting into edible forms of it as well. It's definitely a whole, and I can almost say it's like almost a whole different type of drug, and just in terms of how it affects people and how much more intense the sensation is. And again, I like to say that the stuff your grandma smoked is not the stuff that people are smoking today. It's definitely a different sensation.
When you were talking about the concentrated cannabis, what is hash oil?
So there's a couple of different ways of making hash oil. We can take and make hashish, and then there's a process that adds some chemicals and a process of percolation, and I can extract the oil from that, and that would be the old school hash oil. But now when we talk about most of the time is hash oil or butane hash oil, is I'm going to take the plant material of the cannabis plant material, and it has all these little glistening globules known as trichomes. And I'm going to put it in a jar, and I'm going to squirt butane, the same butane that you use for your lighter at home or a cigar lighter or anything. And it's going to literally, the butane is going to pull those little trichomes, that THC, away from the plant material. And I'm going to collect that liquid, which now is butane and THC, at which time I'm going to boil off the butane, and I'm going to be left with the high concentration of THC. And in some cases, it can be well over 90% THC, which is, again, astronomical.
And if you back in the 80s, 90s, the hash itself was what people smoked as concentrated cannabis. Now they're actually taking the hash portion and even distilling it more, so you're getting in the 90% of 90% of it is actual THC, where back then with just the hash, it was probably more like 50 or 60%.
Are these like laced with other chemicals other than like when you're like trying to concentrate? Do they lace it with other chemicals?
With the hash oil, they have to be pretty careful that they get all the butane out if they're using the butane method, because that can obviously create just a myriad of problems. One is butane's obscenely flammable. Two, it's not really particularly good for your lungs. So if they're not doing what they're supposed to do with it in extracting it. And I hate the term using it, extracting it properly, because I don't think that we were ever supposed to extract THC at this level anyway to begin with. So, there you go. That would be a good way of looking at it, safely. But anyway, to do it safely, it involves a lot of process, and that can go into a myriad of problems there, because butane is also hard on hoses and clamps and fittings, and there's fires and explosions, and there's just so many environmental issues that come with it. We could spend all day talking about just the environmental issues with making hash oil from butane or even alcohol. So it's just a many problems.
What's the one way you take? Is it dabbing?
Yeah. So the slang term for smoking a concentrate is called dabbing. And what they'll do is they'll take a what they call a nail, and it's usually either quartz or it could be titanium, and it has a hole in the middle of that nail, and they'll insert it into a pipe, the slang term for which a water pipe, usually a slang term for which is like a water bong. And then they'll heat that nail to very, very high temperatures. And then they're just going to take a little sticky ball of that hash oil, which looks like honey. Oftentimes you may even hear the term butane honey oil. And it's kind of thick. And they're going to take a nail or something sharp and that they can hold on to that little, ball. And they're going to touch it to that nail, and it's going to instantly vaporize it. And hence the term dabbing. So imagine dabbing a hot nail with the wax on there. They're going to dab it on there, and it's going to instantly vaporize and inhale the THC that way.
And this concentrate can be, how much THC would be in the concentrate? Would it be up almost 100%?
That's correct. It's very high.
And then the effect, is there, I'm assuming these are like hallucinogenic effects or anything like that?
It definitely has a hallucinogenic effect to it, particularly when you get into the concentrates. People are definitely seeing things that they don't know. They're having intelligent conversations with people from different places, other planets. And they're talking to, one of the things that Joe Rogan, I don't know if you guys listen to his podcast, but he talks about like when he does stuff that, particularly with edibles, that he will talk to the dolphins on the boat that he's sailing on. So, it's not stuff that we associated like with what? That's just weed. No, this is on a whole nother level. And it does definitely have hallucinogenic qualities to it.
I was just going to say basically the crux of all of this is especially with the edibles and all of the different manners in which people can use the different types of products these days that are out there. One, the amount of oversight over the quality control that's going into these products. So you might be getting it from a dispensary or somewhere, it might not just be from, somebody's garage kitchen. It might be from someplace reputable, but the amount of quality control going into what the concentration is in these products is not, we don't know.
What are the key takeaways, and this is for all of you, that you would like listeners to learn from this discussion out of everything we've talked about? Officer Herbert, we'll start again with you.
I think the key takeaway is that we need to, I think we should make people understand how driving and understand what they're doing. I think that a lot of people take what they do when they're behind the wheel for granted. And then when you introduce any type of substance that affects my ability to operate a motor vehicle safely, that you can be arrested for it. And if it doesn't matter, like Kelly said earlier, if it was prescription or if it's cannabis or if it's even gasoline, if it's affecting your ability to operate a vehicle safely, then we can arrest you for driving under the influence. And then I think at least from a law enforcement perspective, getting officers better trained, and making sure that they take ARIDE training and DRE training, and understanding how drugs affect the body, and then being able to articulate that when I'm in front of Kelly in court and she's asking me questions. And the other component being the people from the lab, coming up and saying, yeah, these are very consistent with somebody who's ingested a controlled substance, and, making a big picture thing. And it's just going to take a lot of work on all our parts. And I think we can do it.
All right, Sara, and then Mike.
I think one of the important key takeaways too is, I know we were just discussing like some of the hallucinogenic effects, and these are the more like the extremes types of samples. I know the majority of cases that I've been involved in court, I want to say that the symptoms of impairment were a lot more subtle. They were present, but they were more subtle. And it's important to realize that if you're using a drug that you're hoping to alter some state of being in some way, whether you're hoping to feel more relaxed or some euphoric feelings or an overall sense of well-being. With that is also going to come some other side effects, such as decreased ability to divide your attention and inability to gauge time and space and your spatial perception. These are all things that are very important for driving. So going into this, even if you're not hallucinating and seeing dolphins, and even if you don't feel quite as drunk as you would if you had, been out at the bar all night long, you can still be mentally impaired behind the wheel. It's important to remember that people often compare it to alcohol and think like, well, it's not as bad as being hammered. And well, maybe it's not, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay.
Good point. Mike?
For me, it kind of boils down to reaction time. A person, and I say this in court pretty much with all drugs, if a person's traveling 30 miles an hour, which is a pretty slow speed for most places, that's 44 feet per second. So if their reaction response time diminishes as much as a half of a second, that's 22 unintended feet that they could travel. And that's roughly the width of two to three crosswalks. So it's a small amount of impairment, but it can certainly cause a lot of damage.
And Kelly?
I think one of the key takeaways is that marijuana has been minimized, I feel, for a while now. Just saying, oh, it's just marijuana. It's not that big of a deal. It's legal if you're over 21. And the truth is, it might be legal to ingest it if you're over 21, but that does not mean you should be then driving or getting behind the wheel of the car. And the other important part is, if you're under 21, you're not supposed to be ingesting any marijuana or any cannabis. This is not the marijuana back from the 70s or the 60s. This is way more serious, way more concentrated, and it affects the way you can drive. When in this day and age, when we have the option of Uber and Lyft or any of the rideshare companies, take advantage of that. I mean, if you choose to drink or drive or ingest marijuana, just don't drive. Just get a cab, get an Uber, get a Lyft. I think that's probably one of the more important things to think about.
Perfect. Well, hopefully listening to the insight, the stats, in your general opinions, people will share the information and help us prevent people from engaging in marijuana and driving and alcohol and drugs, for that matter. So thanks, everybody, for your time today and sharing all this information. And for our listeners, we'll have additional information on our show notes page with some of the numbers that we talked about and resources. So thanks, everybody, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.